The polished mahogany of the boardroom table reflected the city's afternoon glare, a distorted mirror showing a world I rarely inhabited. My gaze drifted past the meticulously arranged spreadsheets on the tablet before me, past the stern faces of the corporate executives, and out the expansive glass wall. Far below, the city pulsed with an indifferent rhythm, a stark contrast to the quiet hum of my own analytical mind. I'd been drafted into this strategic planning session by a well-meaning university dean, a futile attempt to broaden my horizons beyond the controlled chaos of my forensic anthropology lab. My horizons, I often thought, were quite broad enough, thank you. They simply pointed downward, into the earth, into the past, into the secrets bodies held. My phone, a discreet vibration against my thigh, shattered the veneer of corporate decorum I was barely maintaining. A glance at the caller ID. Detective Miller. My muscles tensed, a familiar surge of adrenaline. Miller only called when things were truly perplexing, when the earth had coughed up something genuinely indigestible. Excusing myself with a mumbled apology that nobody seemed to register, I stepped out onto the plush carpet of the executive hallway, the city's distant murmur now my only company. Miller, I answered, my voice already shifting from polite academic to sharp investigator. Arthur. You busy? The detective's voice, usually a gravelly monotone, held an unusual edge, a mixture of disbelief and urgency. Currently navigating the treacherous waters of Q3 projections. But I suspect you have something more tangible than projected deficits. My attempt at levity fell flat, as it often did with Miller. Tangible, yes. Explainable? Not a chance. We've got a situation. Natural History Museum. You know the derelict one on Elm Street sealed up for 20 years? My brow furrowed. The one they've been trying to get funding to demolish for a decade? What about it? Construction crew doing preliminary site assessment found. Well, they found a chamber, subterranean, and inside, Arthur, inside there's a body. A body wasn't unusual. A sealed chamber beneath a derelict museum was. Recent? Old? Decomposed? I rattled off the standard questions, already feeling the pull of the unknown. Miller hesitated. A rare occurrence. That's the thing. It's mummified, perfectly. Not a speck of decay, like it was laid to rest yesterday, but it feels ancient. No, not feels ancient. It looks ancient, but utterly pristine. Like a museum exhibit itself, only it wasn't supposed to be there. And it wasn't discovered by archaeologists, Arthur. It was found by a guy with a jackhammer. My mind raced. Natural mummification was rare in this climate, requiring specific, extreme conditions. A sealed chamber might provide some stability, but perfectly preserved after an unknown duration? That screamed artifice. I'm on my way. The drive across the city felt too slow, the mundane traffic a frustrating obstacle. The Natural History Museum loomed ahead, a grand, decaying structure of limestone and forgotten dreams. Scaffolding clung to its facade like skeletal vines, and the grand entrance was boarded over, a monument to municipal neglect. Police vehicles, their lights flashing a silent, urgent warning, clustered around a side entrance where a section of the perimeter fence had been peeled back. I found Miller near a makeshift command post, his face etched with a weary fascination. Arthur, thanks for getting here so quickly. He gestured towards a gaping hole in the museum's foundation, shored up with temporary beams. Down there, they were looking for a stable point to sink a new support pillar, hit bedrock, then this. A void, a bricked-up archway. They blasted through. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, disturbed dust, and something else. A faint, almost metallic tang I couldn't quite place. I donned my disposable coveralls, gloves, and a particulate mask, my standard uniform for descending into the unknown. What's the access like? Tight. We've got lighting, but it's a crawl in places. You'll want to be careful. The air's been sampled. It's breathable, but stagnant. I followed a uniformed officer, navigating a labyrinth of debris-strewn corridors, The museum's past whispering from every shadow. Cracked display cases held nothing but dust. Murals of long-extinct creatures stared down with vacant eyes. The silence was profound, broken only by our footsteps and the distant murmur of police radios. We reached the excavation site, a crude tunnel carved through rubble and earth, descending sharply. The air grew cooler, heavier. The chamber itself was a revelation. It wasn't large, perhaps 4 meters by 3, carved from the earth and lined with rough-hewn stone blocks, almost cyclopean in their scale. The light from the portable lamps illuminated a tableau that stole my breath. In the center, resting on a raised stone slab, was the body. Miller hadn't exaggerated. It was mummified, yes, but unlike anything I had ever encountered. The skin, a deep uniform ochre, was taut, stretched over bone and muscle with an almost lifelike precision. Every detail, the slight curve of the lips, the individual strands of hair, the texture of the fingernails was astonishingly preserved. No decay, no desiccation, no signs of insect activity. It lay supine, hands crossed over its chest, clad in what appeared to be simple, unadorned linen, which had also resisted the ravages of time. "My God," I murmured, stepping closer, my voice hushed. This wasn't natural mummification. This was engineered. The air, though stagnant, lacked the usual earthy scent of ancient tombs. Instead, there was that subtle metallic tang, stronger now, almost chemical. I circled the slab slowly, my eyes absorbing every detail. The chamber itself was bare. No artifacts, no inscriptions, just the body. I pulled a small, high-magnification lens from my kit, my gloved fingers trembling slightly with a mix of awe and intellectual hunger. I leaned in, examining the skin, the linen. It shimmered minutely under the harsh lamplight, like microscopic salt crystals, but with an unnatural, almost synthetic gleam. I carefully took a series of close-up photographs, then used a sterile swab to collect a minute sample. "This isn't natural desiccation," I finally declared, pulling back. "Not even close. This level of preservation in these conditions. It's deliberate, highly sophisticated. Whatever they used, it's not something I've seen before." Miller grunted, his gaze fixed on the body. "Meaning what, Arthur? Someone buried this person like this and sealed them away? For how long?" I stared at the perfectly preserved face, at the secrets held behind those closed, unseeing eyes. That's the question, isn't it? How long? And more importantly, what did they use? Because this isn't just a body, Miller. This is a chemical masterpiece. And I have a very strong feeling it's not the only one. The tension in the small chamber was palpable, a heavy cloak of foreboding. My gaze remained fixed on the face, a tableau frozen in time. Miller, the lead investigator from the local precinct, shifted beside me, his flashlight beam dancing across the perfectly preserved features. Not just a body. I repeated, the words hanging heavy between us. This is a chemical masterpiece. I turned to the 2 forensic technicians, their faces illuminated by headlamps, carefully documenting every millimeter of the discovery. Every layer, every speck of dust. Treat it like a priceless artifact, no shortcuts. The exhumation was a meticulous, agonizingly slow dance. We worked for hours in the confined space, the silence punctuated only by the soft click of cameras and the whispered instructions. My team, accustomed to the delicate nature of archaeological recoveries but rarely confronted with such macabre artistry, moved with practiced precision. They used specialized brushes, micro-vacuums, and custom-fabricated lifting apparatuses to stabilize the mummified remains. The body, still nestled within its intricately sealed enclosure, felt impossibly fragile yet undeniably solid. I supervised every move, my focus absolute, my mind already cataloging potential contaminants, environmental factors, and the sheer audacity of the perpetrator. The sealed chamber itself was a puzzle, its construction pointing to a deliberate long-term concealment. Finally, after what felt like an entire shift spent hunched over, the entire sarcophagus-like structure, complete with its preserved occupant, was secured within a climate-controlled transport unit. We moved it out of the derelict museum and across town to a secured, purpose-built analysis facility, a sectioned-off wing of an abandoned factory, repurposed for sensitive forensic work. Under the harsh glow of the examination lights, the true work began. My assistant, a meticulous analyst named Kai, began the painstaking process of opening the sealed casing. The air inside the container was still, inert, a testament to the creator's skill. I donned my examination gloves, my focus narrowing to the task at hand. The initial skeletal analysis confirmed my suspicions. The remains belonged to a young adult, likely in their late teens or early 20s at the time of death. The bone density, the unfused epiphyses, they all pointed to youth. Determining the precise age of death was more challenging due to the extreme preservation, but the context, the layers of dust, the archaic methods of sealing all suggested decades, not centuries. The lack of significant trauma was also peculiar. No obvious signs of a struggle or fatal wound. It was as if the individual had simply fallen asleep. Kai, meanwhile, had begun swabbing the surface of the mummified tissue, collecting samples for chemical profiling. It's incredibly complex. Multiple organic and inorganic elements, precisely balanced. It's not a natural process, not even a simple embalming fluid. I leaned closer to the screen, watching the jagged peaks and valleys of the spectral analysis. No, it's not. This is engineered, deliberately, and with an understanding of chemistry that goes far beyond rudimentary preservation. The complexity of the compound, its unique molecular signature, was a fingerprint in itself. This wasn't some ancient, forgotten burial rite. This was modern, sophisticated, and chillingly precise. The revelation of the young age of the deceased, coupled with the advanced chemical signature, set a different kind of alarm bell ringing. This wasn't an archaeological find, not a historical curiosity. This was a crime, a deliberate act of macabre preservation. My findings, however, didn't immediately sway everyone. Later that day, I found myself participating in an emergency briefing, patching into a secure video conference from the factory floor to a penthouse boardroom during an emergency call. The faces on the screen were a mix of stern-faced precinct brass and a few skeptical officials from the Historical Preservation Society. With all due respect, Arthur, the lead detective, a man with a perpetually furrowed brow, stated, his voice flat through the speakers, "This sounds like a fascinating historical discovery. Are you absolutely certain this isn't some ancient, previously unknown preservation technique?" "Detective, with all due respect, my findings are irrefutable," I countered, leaning into the camera, my voice calm but firm. "The skeletal markers indicate an individual who died within the last 50 to 70 years, at most. And the chemical compound we've isolated for the mummification process is not ancient. It's an exceptionally rare, highly refined mixture. One that requires significant chemical knowledge and resources to synthesize." A historical society representative, an older woman with sharp eyes, interjected, "But the sealed chamber, Dr. Chen. Its construction suggests a much older origin." "The chamber was sealed," I clarified, emphasizing the word. "Not necessarily built in antiquity. The sealing materials, the mortar, even the air composition inside, it's all being analyzed. But the body itself, the chemical signature, points to a deliberate recent act. Someone meticulously prepared this individual, not for burial, but for display, for preservation. And the level of expertise involved suggests a perpetrator with a very specific and highly dangerous obsession." The silence on the other end of the line was thick with skepticism, but also a dawning realization. I knew I hadn't convinced them entirely, but I had planted the seed of doubt. This wasn't a relic. It was a victim. My determination solidified. I had to prove this wasn't an accident of history. The chief administrator's face projected onto the boardroom's massive screen was a study in controlled displeasure. My words, not a relic, but a victim, a modern chemical masterpiece, hung in the air like an accusation. The other faces, a scattering of senior officials and a legal representative, offered varying degrees of polite disbelief. They wanted to categorize, to contain, to explain away the impossible. I wanted answers, and I knew I wouldn't find them by placating their need for convenient narratives. "Gentlemen," I'd said, my voice cutting through the polite murmur, "the level of sophistication involved in that preservation suggests a deliberate, meticulous process. This isn't ancient lore, it's engineered, and it points to a mind with a profound and disturbing understanding of human physiology and chemical reactions." The head of security, a man whose skepticism was etched into every line of his face, had merely grunted. "Or a very advanced hoax, Arthur. We've seen them before." "Not like this," I countered, my gaze sweeping across the virtual room. "Not with this signature. This isn't a curiosity. It's a crime scene that's been waiting for decades, maybe longer, to be found." The call ended with no firm commitments, only a vague promise of further review. I slammed the lid of my laptop shut, the click echoing in the cavernous boardroom. The polished mahogany table reflected my frustrated expression. They saw a problem. I saw a meticulously crafted puzzle, and the first piece had been dropped right into my lap. I didn't need their approval to dig. I needed to understand the museum itself. I drove back to the derelict building, the late afternoon sun casting long, skeletal shadows across its crumbling facade. The air inside the museum was heavy with the scent of dust and neglect. A palpable weight that pressed in on me as I made my way to the administrative offices. The museum's current caretaker, a stoic woman with a permanent frown, had grudgingly granted me access to the archives. I spent hours sifting through decades of acquisition records, exhibition notes, and staff rosters. The chief administrator had scoffed at my suggestion of a modern link to the body, insisting the museum had always been a bastion of historical preservation, devoid of any unusual incidents. But the paper trail, or lack thereof, told a different story. There was a peculiar lacuna in the records, a period from the late 1960s to the early 1980s that seemed particularly sparse. Key inventory lists were missing, renovation plans were incomplete, and staffing records for certain departments were conspicuously thin. Then I found it, tucked away in a dusty cabinet labeled Miscellaneous Architectural Drawings, pre-85. Beneath a pile of faded blueprints for a planned, never-executed gift shop, lay a smaller, unbound folio. Its cover was blank, but the paper felt different, thicker, almost waxy. Not the main storage areas, nor the boiler room, but a sub-level, a hidden extension, and within those drawings, meticulous annotations in a precise, almost clinical hand. My eyes landed on a name, scrawled repeatedly next to chemical formulas and structural modifications. Dr. Elias Thorne. The museum's historical director had briefly mentioned a reclusive chemist, a brilliant but eccentric man who had worked for the museum in the late 70s, ostensibly on advanced preservation techniques for delicate artifacts. He disappeared abruptly, his departure marked only by a terse, single-line memo citing personal reasons. No forwarding address, no pension details, just a void. One particular drawing caught my attention, a cross-section of the sublevel, detailing a sealed chamber far deeper than the one where the mummified body had been found. Below it, a handwritten note. Project Chimera, Phase 2, Optimal Stabilization Parameters. A sharp ring from my phone startled me, pulling me from the hypnotic grip of Thorne's diagrams. It was my assistant, his voice tight with urgency. "Arthur," the chief analyst just called. "We've got the full spectral analysis on the preservative. It's unique. Not a commercial product, not even a known industrial blend. It's a custom-formulated solution. Highly complex, incredibly stable. The molecular structure suggests a deliberate synthesis, not an accidental discovery. My mind raced, connecting the dots. A reclusive chemist. A period of missing records. Hidden blueprints for a secret subterranean chamber. A custom-formulated chemical signature. A masterpiece of preservation. Thorne hadn't been preserving artifacts. He'd been perfecting a process. And the body we found? He's never seen anything like it. It would require advanced chemical engineering knowledge, decades of experimentation, and a significant isolated facility to perfect. And Arthur, the chief analyst, thinks it's designed for long-term organic preservation. Human organic preservation. The folio slipped from my fingers, scattering its secrets across the dusty floor. Thorne hadn't just disappeared. The body in the chamber wasn't an isolated incident. It was proof of concept. This wasn't about a single victim anymore. This was about a pattern, a legacy of macabre obsession, meticulously crafted and hidden beneath layers of history and neglect, waiting for someone to finally uncover its true, horrifying purpose. The dusty folio lay spread on my workbench, its brittle pages whispering of a dark obsession. I ignored the historical sketches, focusing instead on the cryptic chemical notations scrawled in the margins. My own analysis equipment hummed around me, projecting intricate molecular structures onto a holographic display. The preservation agent used on the first victim was a complex cocktail, a masterwork of macabre chemistry, but I was closing in on its core. Hours blurred into a single-minded pursuit. My fingers, stained with reagents, danced across touchscreens, cross-referencing spectral data. The initial findings had pointed to several unusual compounds, but one particular concoction stood out. It was an amalgamation of organic and inorganic elements, remarkably stable, designed not just to halt decay, but to actively transform tissue at a molecular level. This wasn't simple embalming. It was a perversion of cryopreservation, a deliberate, sophisticated attempt at stasis through chemical means. Then the breakthrough. A specific, highly customized polymer chain, intricate and virtually impossible to replicate by chance. It was the killer's signature, as unique as a fingerprint, woven into the very fabric of the preserved remains. I isolated its spectroscopic profile, a complex diagram of peaks and valleys that now burned itself into my memory. This wasn't just a chemical, it was a statement. My mind immediately leapt to the folio. Thorne's obsession with eternal forms and the perfect vessel suddenly made terrifying sense. He wasn't just documenting history, he was attempting to create it, to freeze life in a grotesque, permanent tableau. It was a long shot, but if this compound was truly unique, it might have left a trace, however faint, at other scenes. The police database was a vast labyrinthine beast, full of dead ends and unanswered questions. I filtered by era, then by unexplained disappearances where no body was ever recovered. One file snagged my attention. A prominent figure, a historian, vanished in the late 1960s, roughly the same period as the first victim's estimated time of preservation. The case notes mentioned a peculiar, almost waxy residue found on a discarded coat at the historian's last known location, a secluded study in a crumbling manor. At the time, it had been dismissed as an unknown organic contaminant, too insignificant to pursue. But the description, vague as it was, resonated with the initial tactile feel of the preserved body in the chamber. I requested the archived samples, a long shot given the decades that had passed. A colleague, a quiet forensics technician, located a small, desiccated swab from the original evidence locker. Under my high-resolution microscope, I saw it. Microscopic fragments of the same distinctive polymer. It was faint, degraded, but unmistakably the same signature. The first victim wasn't an isolated incident. This historian, vanished without a trace, had likely been an earlier attempt. Perhaps a failure, a subject whose preservation hadn't been successful enough for the killer's macabre standards, leading to no body being left behind, or perhaps dissolved entirely. He'd been experimenting, refining his technique, leaving a trail of spectral victims in his wake. The folio wasn't just a record, it was a twisted research journal. My phone rang, a sharp, insistent jolt. Another one. This wasn't just history I was digging up, it was an active, ongoing horror. The detective stood by a large screen displaying satellite imagery, his face grim. A female colleague, her expression pale, sat hunched over a tablet. "We found a second body," the detective stated, his gaze meeting mine. "Similar circumstances, hidden location, but different." He gestured to the screen. The image zoomed in on an aerial view of an old university campus, then a detail of its sprawling, ivy-clad buildings, finally focusing on a small, overgrown entrance to what looked like a subterranean passage. Catacombs beneath the old university's original theology wing. Local urban explorers stumbled upon it. My mind raced. Catacombs, another sealed, forgotten space. The killer's modus operandi was consistent, but the different part gnawed at me. The university grounds were deserted, bathed in the stark glare of hastily erected floodlights. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like overripe fruit left too long. My breath plumed in the cool, stagnant air. We found it deeper in a small side chamber, illuminated by a single, powerful lamp. This time, the body wasn't encased in a pristine, crystalline cocoon. It lay on a rough stone slab, partially covered by a canvas sheet. When the detective pulled it back, a gasp escaped my lips. The body was clearly human, but its form was distorted, its skin a mottled, greenish-brown. Degradation was evident. Tissue had withered unevenly, some areas appearing desiccated, others strangely fluid. Yet, despite the obvious decay, there was a strange resilience to it, an unnatural resistance to complete decomposition. I knelt, my forensic kit already open. The air around the remains carried that same faint metallic sweetness I'd noticed at the entrance, only stronger here. A quick field test for the specific polymer signature confirmed my fears. It's different, less complete, as if the method was still being refined or perhaps interrupted. A learning curve or a forced change in technique. The killer wasn't just a ghost from the past. They were a living, evolving entity, honing their horrifying craft, leaving a trail of experimental subjects in their wake. The hunt was far from over. Outside, the city shimmered under a cold, indifferent sky, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and impending dread. I stood at the head of the polished obsidian table, my fingers tracing the outline of a digital photograph projected onto the large screen. It was the second body, or what remained of it. Less perfect, certainly, than our initial discovery, but unmistakably linked. The preservation agents in the second subject are a crude approximation of the first, I began, my voice cutting through the hushed tension. Less effective, more volatile. The skin shows signs of accelerated dehydration, and there's evidence of significant tissue degradation in the extremities. But the underlying chemical signature? It's the same unique compound mixture, the same base, modified. What does that tell us? It tells us this isn't an isolated incident or a single forgotten act, I replied, meeting his gaze. It tells us the individual responsible for the first preservation, the one beneath the museum, has been experimenting. Refining their process. I nodded slowly. Precisely. A killer obsessed with permanence, with arresting decay, to treat human life as a medium for a scientific, perhaps pseudo-scientific pursuit. We need to identify both victims, I continued, gesturing to the screen, where images of the first, perfectly mummified subject now cycled alongside the second, less fortunate one. The first body, given its near-perfect state, could be decades, even a century old. The second, less so. The preservation methods, though flawed, still complicate traditional identification. Dental records, fingerprints, they're either degraded or altered by the chemical process. "And how do we do that, Arthur?" asked the lead detective. His brow furrowed. "We're talking about subjects who might have vanished long before anyone thought to log a missing tooth." "We broaden our search," I instructed, turning to address the room. "Forget standard missing persons. We need to look for patterns of disappearance among obscure social circles. Academic institutions, particularly those with a focus on chemistry, antiquarian studies, or even fringe historical societies. Any individual or group with an interest in esoteric preservation techniques, or an unusual fascination with the past." Despite the degradation, a detail from the initial scene report gnawed at me. A small, almost imperceptible mark. It was easy to miss, obscured by residue from the preservation agents and the natural erosion of the stone. The image sharpened, the pixelated lines resolving into a distinct, albeit faded, symbol. It wasn't a letter or a number. It spoke of ancient knowledge, of hidden meanings. "I found this during the initial examination of the scene," I explained, my voice low. "It's not natural erosion. It's a deliberate carving. And it's not random." I paused, allowing the symbol to sink in. This symbol, I've seen it before. Not in a textbook, not in a museum exhibit. It was in an obscure architectural drawing, a preliminary sketch of the museum's original foundation, tucked away in the city archives during my initial research into the first discovery. It was meant to be incorporated into a decorative frieze on the building's exterior, but the design was ultimately rejected for being too esoteric by the original benefactor. A collective intake of breath filled the boardroom. The lead detective's eyes widened. "So, the museum isn't just a dumping ground. It's significant." "More than significant," I affirmed, my mind racing through possibilities. This symbol wasn't widely known. It was part of a very specific, very limited set of plans. The prominent chemist, the one whose research into preservation techniques we've been investigating, was a key consultant during the museum's early development. He had access to those initial designs. He was known for his fascination with ancient Egyptian preservation methods, yes, but also for his deep dive into more unconventional historical practices. This wasn't just about preserving bodies. The symbol, the link to the museum's discarded past, the chemist's obscure interests, it all pointed to something far more sinister. The killer wasn't just a scientist, they were a zealot. We weren't just hunting a killer. We were unearthing a twisted legacy. Outside, the city shimmered under a weak winter sun, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of my words. I stood before the holographic display, the schematics of the subterranean chamber now overlaid with molecular structures and historical timelines. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman with a perpetually furrowed brow, sat opposite me, her gaze unblinking. Other senior officers and analysts occupied the surrounding seats, their expressions ranging from grim concentration to thinly veiled skepticism. "The preservation method," I explained, gesturing to a magnified image of the compound I'd extracted, "is not a single chemical. It's a complex multi-stage process. A base layer, a desiccant, followed by a unique sealant, and then an anoxic encapsulation. Each component, while known individually, is applied in a sequence and concentration that suggests an advanced understanding of both organic chemistry and the specific properties of human tissue. This isn't amateur work, nor is it a forgotten folk remedy." I paused, letting the implications sink in. The most striking element is a specific polymer, incredibly stable, almost inert. Patents that, curiously, never saw widespread commercial application due to their niche and expensive nature. A click of a remote, and the display shifted to old, grainy photographs and faded patent documents. "The primary inventor listed on these patents," I continued, my voice deliberately even, "is a chemist named Evelyn Reed." At the time, he was a pioneering figure in polymer science, known for her unorthodox approaches and a singular focus on material longevity. Records indicate a brief, almost forgotten affiliation with the museum's original benefactor, a consultancy project on artifact stabilization that was quietly terminated. The lead investigator leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Evelyn Reed, is she still alive? He is, I confirmed. Now in her late 80s, reclusive, living in an old Victorian house on the city's outskirts. Her public work ceased abruptly in the early 1980s. No publications, no conferences, just silence. The silence in the boardroom stretched, punctuated only by the hum of the ventilation system. The pieces were beginning to align, forming a pattern that was both terrifying and disturbingly logical. The zealot I'd suspected wasn't just a scientist. They were a master of their craft, and the name Evelyn Reed resonated with that mastery. Later that afternoon, the lead investigator and I found ourselves navigating a labyrinth of overgrown rose bushes and peeling paint, approaching the front door of Dr. Evelyn Reed's residence. The house itself seemed to sag with age, a relic of a bygone era. It pricked at my senses, a ghost of a memory from the subterranean chamber. The door creaked open to reveal a woman who appeared as fragile as spun glass. Her hair, a wispy cloud of white, framed a face etched with the deep lines of time. Her eyes, however, held a surprising sharpness, darting between us with an almost predatory intelligence. "Dr. Reed?" the lead investigator began, her tone gentle, respectful. The old woman's voice was a dry rustle. "I haven't been Dr. anything for decades. What do you want?" We explained our purpose, carefully omitting the more macabre details, focusing on the historical preservation aspects, the museum, her past work. She listened, her gaze unblinking, occasionally offering a dismissive wave of a hand. "Preservation?" she scoffed, a dry laugh escaping her lips. "Childish pursuits. My work was for industry, for science, for the future, not for dusty relics." She denied any recollection of the specific patents I mentioned, claiming her memory was not what it once was. She dismissed her brief association with the museum's benefactor as a minor consultation, a waste of my time. "Those days are long behind me," she insisted, her voice gaining a touch of weary indignation. "I dabble in rose gardening now. They were gnarled with age, yes, but beneath the translucent skin, the knuckles were unexpectedly robust. And on the pad of her right index finger, a faint, almost imperceptible stain. A subtle reddish-brown hue that, to my forensic eye, wasn't consistent with gardening soil or ordinary household grime. It had a crystalline, almost metallic glint when it caught the light, a resonance with the trace elements I'd found in the mummified remains. The lead investigator continued her line of questioning, but I was no longer fully listening. My eyes scanned the dimly lit entryway, then the glimpse I caught of a cluttered living room. Dust motes danced in the shafts of weak sunlight, illuminating stacks of ancient books, porcelain figurines, and a general air of genteel neglect. Yet tucked away on a small antique side table, partially obscured by a wilting fern, I spotted it. A small, intricately carved wooden box. It looked like a decorative item, but my instinct screamed otherwise. The wood had a peculiar sheen, almost too perfectly preserved for its apparent age. And the faint metallic scent I detected outside was stronger here, emanating subtly from the box itself. It wasn't the smell of old wood or dust. It was the whisper of something chemically inert, something designed to last. Our interview concluded without any direct admissions. Dr. Reed remained steadfast in her denials, painting herself as a frail, forgetful old woman. That stain on her finger, the scent in the air, that box, it's all too specific, too familiar. The lead investigator considered my words, her gaze sweeping over the silent house. "You think she's our killer?" "I think she's either the architect of this macabre preservation," I replied, the tension coiling tighter in my chest, or he was deeply involved, perhaps a mentor to someone who is. Someone who learned her art and twisted it to their own horrifying ends. By nightfall, a surveillance team had been discreetly established around Dr. Evelyn Reed's property. The hunt had narrowed, the focus sharpening to a reclusive figure who claimed to be long retired, but whose hands, and whose home, told a very different story. It was well past midnight, the kind of hour when exhaustion started blurring the edges of focus, but the gravity of the situation kept my senses painfully sharp. I stood by the long, polished table, a sheaf of printouts from the surveillance team clutched in my hand. The quiet hum of the building's HVAC system was the only sound for a long moment, until the lead detective cleared his throat. "No direct movement from Reed's property, Arthur," the detective began, his voice raspy from hours of monitoring. "But we found something else. An old registered vehicle parked half a mile down the road from her estate. Belongs to her nephew, apparently. A man named Elias. He was reported missing 5 years ago, presumed dead after a boating accident." My gaze snapped to the detective. "Missing 5 years? Why wasn't this flagged sooner?" "Paperwork, Arthur. Lots of it. His disappearance was handled by a different jurisdiction, a coastal community. Reed listed him as next of kin on some old property deeds, but the connection was tenuous, years old. The vehicle was only linked through a recent DMV query for lapsed registration." The detective gestured to a large screen displaying a grainy infrared image of a dilapidated sedan. "The thermal signature suggests it's been recently driven, consistent with a specific type of pollen, according to the botanist we pulled in." I felt a cold prickle along my spine. Pollen. The kind of detail that only a forensic eye would catch, or a killer meticulous enough to track. "What kind of pollen?" "A rare cultivar of the canna lily," a colleague added, leaning forward, a tablet glowing in his hands. "One that Evelyn Reed was known to cultivate in her private conservatory. Old photographs show her with them." The pieces began to shift, to click into place with an unnerving precision. Elias, the presumed dead nephew. A vehicle, recently used, parked near Reed's isolated property. The specific pollen. It was too much to be coincidence. He had mentored a handful of students, but her family was always kept at arm's length, a protective barrier around her work. Except for Elias. I remembered a passing mention in an old academic journal, a footnote attributing a minor procedural refinement to E. He was, briefly, left the program after a year, supposedly for personal reasons. There's a note in his file about a disagreement with Reed over the ethical implications of her work. Ethical implications. That meant he understood the science, the method. And if he disagreed, he knew the potential for its misuse. But what if his disappearance wasn't an accident? What if it was a staged exit, a deliberate vanishing act to allow him to operate in the shadows? The notion tightened my chest. Reed might have laid the groundwork, but someone else was actively cultivating the gruesome harvest. "The chemical signature," I pressed, turning to the project lead, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. "What did the latest analysis from the bodies show about the precursor?" She pulled up a complex diagram on the main screen, devoid of any equations, focusing instead on structural representation. "We've isolated a unique compound. It's a highly modified variant of a common fixative, but with an added, extremely rare organic catalyst. The synthesis pathway is incredibly complex, requiring precise environmental controls and a precursor that isn't commercially available in its refined form. It's derived from a specific bioengineered fungus." She paused, letting the information sink in. "And the only known research facility that ever worked with that specific fungal strain, developing its extraction and refinement, was a small, privately funded lab established by Evelyn Reed herself, decades ago. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a reveal. Reed's nephew, Elias, had not only the knowledge but potentially the access to a forgotten legacy of his aunt's research. the very key to the advanced preservation. He wasn't just an apprentice. He was a successor, operating with a ruthless efficiency that surpassed even Reed's theoretical framework. The latest mummified victims, the ones with the pristine, almost artistic preservation, were his handiwork. He had perfected the method. "He's the active killer," I stated, the words hanging heavy in the air. Elias isn't missing. He's been operating under the radar, using his aunt's techniques, refining them. The initial mummified body, the one that started all this, that was Reed's work. The subsequent ones, the ones with the subtly improved preservation, the ones we found the advanced catalyst in, those are Elias's. The room fell silent, the implication clear. We weren't hunting a single reclusive figure anymore. We were hunting an active, contemporary predator, one who had been hiding in plain sight, presumed dead. The urgency in the room escalated from a simmering tension to a palpable electric current. Then, the final horrifying piece clicked into place. The meticulousness of the preservation, the almost reverent way the bodies were posed, the subtle differences in the chemical composition that spoke of refinement rather than mere repetition. It wasn't just about preserving life, or even an obsession with immortality. It was about collecting. Each victim a specimen, carefully prepared, curated. Elias wasn't just a killer. He was an artist of the macabre, building a private museum of the dead. A collection. He's not just preserving, he's building a collection, a gallery of his victims. The lead detective nodded slowly, his eyes grim. Then our target just got a lot more dangerous, Arthur, and a lot harder to find. The city lights outside the boardroom seemed to mock us, millions of tiny beacons, each one a potential witness or a potential victim. The hunt had just begun anew. The city lights, once a mocking array of indifferent beacons, now felt like 1,000 predatory eyes, each one watching our desperate scramble. The lead detective's words from earlier still echoed. Then our target just got a lot more dangerous, Arthur, and a lot harder to find. He was right. We were chasing a ghost with a specific horrifying agenda. A colleague, a forensic analyst with a knack for digital archaeology, tapped frantically at a tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. The conference table, usually a polished surface for strategic discussions, was now buried under a blizzard of printouts. Victim profiles, geographic maps, timelines stretching back decades. "Still nothing cohesive, Arthur," the analyst mumbled, not looking up. "The preservation method, yes, it's consistent. But the victims themselves, on the surface, they're disparate. Different ages, different backgrounds, different social circles." I leaned over the table, my finger tracing a line on a photograph of the latest discovery. A young sculptor, her features serene even in death, her skin impossibly unblemished. "But there has to be a link beyond the chemical signature," I countered, my voice tight with frustration. "This isn't random. This is precise, deliberate. He's selecting them." "We've got a problem. Just got an anonymous tip, a message, dropped off at the precinct's front desk. Addressed to you, Arthur." My stomach tightened. A taunt. I took the folded paper he offered. It was a single sheet, thick cream stock, the words typed in an antiquated serif font. "The work continues, Arthur. Beauty requires preservation. The next canvas awaits its final form. A scholar of ancient tongues, perhaps? Or a musician whose melodies transcend the temporal?" A cold dread seeped into my bones. He wasn't just aware of us. He was playing with us. He knew we were closing in on his methods, but he was still a step ahead, hinting at his next victim. "He's testing us," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He's telling us he has a type, but he's obscuring it." "Ancient tongues. Musician." The lead detective mused, pacing the room. "That's still too broad. We've got universities, orchestras, libraries all over the city." I stared at the list of previous victims, their faces, their brief biographies. The sculptor, the botanist discovered years ago, the architect from the turn of the century. Disparate, yes. But what if the link wasn't their profession itself, but something behind it? My eyes scanned the details again, searching for an overlooked commonality. The botanist had been renowned for his work with rare, resilient flora, plants that thrived in extreme conditions. The architect had been celebrated for structures that defied time, built to last for centuries. The sculptor, her work often depicted human forms in states of arrested motion, figures frozen in moments of profound beauty. A jolt went through me. It wasn't about what they did, but how they approached their work, their underlying philosophy. Preservation, immortality. Every single one of them, in their own field, was obsessed with the concept of enduring, of making something last beyond its natural lifespan. The forensic analyst looked up, his eyes widening. The botanist sought plants that defied decay. The architect designed for eternity. The sculptor immortalized transient beauty. And the chemicals, I added, my mind racing. He's not just preserving them. He's absorbing their essence, their understanding of permanence. He's trying to learn from them, to perfect his own macabre art. The lead detective stopped pacing. So, a scholar of ancient tongues. Someone who studies dead languages, the words that have survived millennia. A musician whose melodies transcend the temporal. Someone focused on classical compositions, enduring works. We immediately began cross-referencing. The city's academic institutions, its conservatories, its historical societies. The analyst's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up faculty lists, notable alumni, researchers. University's classics department specializes in Sumerian cuneiform, some of the oldest written language known to man. Gave a public lecture last week on the immortal words of the ancients. My gaze shot to the clock on the wall. It was nearing dawn. The killer was operating on an accelerated timeline now, emboldened by his perceived advantage. Get a unit to Professor Thorne's residence now, I barked at the lead detective. And alert campus security. We need to find him. The lead detective was already on his comms, his voice sharp and urgent. As I moved towards the door, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. You're close, Arthur, but not close enough. The finest works require the most precise timing. The line clicked dead. He knew we were moving on Thorne. This wasn't a taunt from a distance. This was a direct challenge. He was watching us. The hunt wasn't just on. It had become a sprint, a desperate race against a killer who had already calculated his next move. We were no longer hunting a ghost. We were being hunted ourselves. Have been searching for truth. I offer it. A final exhibition. A location, precise and coded, followed. My mind scrambled, processing the coordinates, cross-referencing them with the city's grid. Not another museum, not a public space. This was a derelict industrial district, an abandoned processing plant on the city's forgotten outskirts, a place of crumbling concrete and rusted steel. The lead detective, still barking orders into his comms, glanced at me, his brow furrowed with a question I couldn't answer yet. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. The line went dead. He wants me there, I stated, the words tasting like ash. He's inviting me. The detective's eyes narrowed. Who, Arthur? The curator, I replied, the name feeling too polite for the architect of such horrors. The one behind the museum discovery. He just gave me an address. My colleague, a forensics specialist, moved to retrieve a tablet, but I was already out the door. The address seared into my memory. The drive was a blur of flashing city lights giving way to the grimy shadows of industrial decay. This wasn't just a killer. This was an artist, a collector, obsessed with a perverted form of immortality. He wanted an audience for his magnum opus. The abandoned processing plant loomed, a skeletal edifice against the pre-dawn sky. I navigated the rubble-strewn lot, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and something vaguely chemical, metallic. A rusted service door, partially ajar, beckoned. Dust motes danced in the weak beams of my flashlight. My boots crunched on fallen debris, each sound amplified. I followed the killer's coded directions, descending into the building's forgotten guts. Formaldehyde, but something else too. A complex cocktail I'd only encountered in trace amounts before. Then, I saw it. It was illuminated by an array of specialized low-frequency lights, casting an eerie amber glow. And there they were. A dozen of them, perhaps more. Arranged in rows, standing upright within individual transparent enclosures. Each figure, perfectly preserved, encased in a shimmering, almost crystalline substance. Not mummies in the traditional sense, but something far more sophisticated, a grotesque tableau of frozen life. The museum discovery was merely a prelude. This was the full collection. My breath hitched. My flashlight beam trembled as it swept across the faces. Men, women, young, old. Their features were startlingly lifelike, their eyes vacant, reflecting the amber light. The sheer scale was staggering, horrifying. This wasn't decades of work. This was a lifetime. Beautiful, isn't it, Arthur Chen? The voice, no longer distorted but calm, almost serene, came from behind me. I spun around, my hand instinctively going to the small, non-lethal deterrent I carried. Standing amidst his ghastly gallery was a figure, slender and impeccably dressed, his face obscured by the low light and the wide brim of a fedora. He stepped forward, revealing a man in his late 60s, perhaps early 70s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that gleamed with an unsettling pride. The curator. "You understand, don't you?" he continued, gesturing expansively at his collection. "The fleeting nature of existence, the indignity of decay. I offer permanence. You offer them death. Then you desecrate them, turning them into exhibits." "Desecrate?" He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "No, Arthur. I elevate them. I am the ultimate archivist. I saw the potential in each of them, the subtle nuances, the unique chemical compositions that made their preservation a singular challenge. Your museum discovery. A child, yes? A test, a proof of concept for the world. This," he swept his hand across the rows of bodies, "this is my life's work, my legacy." My mind raced, trying to find an angle, a weakness in his twisted logic. "The chemical signature you used, it's incredibly complex. Years of experimentation, wasn't it? But you left traces. In the museum victim. In the soil, in the air around her." His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of surprise. "You are observant, I'll grant you that. A necessary evil, the byproducts of perfection." "Perfection?" I scoffed. "You're so obsessed with preserving the physical form, you've overlooked the fundamental flaw in your art. You haven't saved them. You've stolen their stories, their lives. What about the families, the decades of agony, the unanswered questions?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Sentiment. They are beyond such trivialities now. They exist in a state of perpetual serenity. Look at them, Arthur. They are timeless." "They are empty," I countered, stepping closer to one of the enclosures, forcing myself to meet the vacant gaze of a young woman. "Your process, it's not just about preservation. It's about a specific chemical reaction that arrests cellular function at a precise moment. You're not freezing life, you're freezing a scream." His composure faltered just for a moment. A muscle twitched in his jaw. A necessary component for the transition. "No," I pressed, my voice low but firm. "It's about control. You choose the moment of their end and you freeze it. You believe you're giving them immortality, but you're just capturing their last, most vulnerable breath. And the chemicals, they're not stable indefinitely, are they? Not without constant, precise environmental control. Your perfection is a lie. This entire collection will eventually degrade, just like everything else. It's a temporary illusion." His eyes blazed, the serene mask cracking. "You understand nothing. You are a scientist, not an artist. You quantify, you dissect, you do not appreciate the sublime." "I appreciate truth," I shot back. "And the truth is, you're a predator, not a preservationist. And your art is failing. I can see the microfractures in some of the casings, the subtle clouding in the preservation agent in others. Small, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but they are there. The environment here, it's not perfect. It can't be. Your legacy is already decaying." His gaze darted to the nearest enclosure, then to another. A seed of doubt planted. His elaborate facade of control began to crumble. He had poured his life into this, into the illusion of permanence. To have it dissected, exposed as flawed, was an attack on his very being. Just then, the distant wail of sirens pierced the thick concrete walls, growing steadily louder. The lead detective had been quick. The curator's head snapped towards the sound, his face twisting with a sudden, raw panic. The calm, detached artist was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered man. "No!" he shrieked, lunging towards a control panel I hadn't noticed. I didn't hesitate. I tackled him, sending us both sprawling onto the dusty floor. He thrashed, surprisingly strong for his age, but my adrenaline was surging. The distant wail had been the precursor to an organized storm, a tactical unit sweeping through the subterranean labyrinth with chilling efficiency. I watched as 2 uniformed officers escorted him, his shoulders slumped, out of the chamber. The silence that followed felt heavier than the weight of the earth above us. The immediate aftermath was a blur of controlled chaos. Scene investigators, forensic photographers, and a specialized recovery team swarmed the chambers, their movements precise, their faces grim. My own team, weary but resolute, began the painstaking process of documentation. I moved from one enclosure to the next, my gloved fingers tracing the edges of the hermetically sealed units. The air, once thick with the faint, sweet scent of preservation chemicals, now carried the metallic tang of human exertion and the sterile breath of industrial ventilation. 27. My internal count solidified, a number that pressed against my ribs. 27 lives stolen, meticulously prepared and displayed like grotesque trophies. "Arthur," a colleague called, her voice tight with exhaustion. "We've got another one here, in the wall panel, concealed." I knelt beside her, shining my tactical light into the narrow recess she indicated. There it was, another vacuum-sealed sarcophagus, smaller than the others, tucked away with deliberate craft. This wasn't merely about preservation. It was about curation, about an audience of one. The killer hadn't just sought immortality for his victims. He'd sought an eternal audience for his own twisted genius. He hadn't just collected. He had curated. Each body was a chapter in his gruesome narrative. The work was slow, methodical, and emotionally draining. Every photograph taken, every sample collected, every detailed description of clothing or personal effects was a step closer to giving a name back to these silent figures. We worked for nearly 36 hours straight, fueled by strong coffee and a shared sense of grim purpose. The media, of course, caught wind of the discovery with an alarming speed that only reinforced the insatiable hunger for the macabre. News vans choked the streets above the museum, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like hungry antennae. Every screen, every radio, every digital feed screamed headlines about the mummy maker and his underground graveyard. The public's fascination was a grotesque mirror to the killer's own obsession, a morbid dance between horror and morbid curiosity. 2 days later, the world still reeled. Before me sat a panel of senior law enforcement officers and government officials, their faces etched with a blend of shock and professional gravity. "And based on our preliminary analysis," I stated, my voice hoarse, gesturing to the projected images of the chambers on the massive screen. The preservation method is unprecedented. A combination of advanced polymer embalming and atmospheric control, essentially halting decomposition at a cellular level. The oldest subject we've identified so far dates back 42 years. A senior officer, a man with a perpetually tired gaze, leaned forward. 42 years. And no one knew. Not a single missing person report definitively linked until now? The chemical signature is unique, I explained. We're cross-referencing it with historical disappearance cases nationwide. The sheer scale, the meticulous planning. It speaks to a mind deeply engrossed in a perverse scientific pursuit. He saw himself as an artist, a pioneer of eternal form. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken questions. I felt the weight of them, the ethical tightrope walk that my own field often skirted. Where did scientific curiosity end and human dignity begin? The emotional toll on my team was palpable. I saw the questions in their gazes, the unspoken plea for meaning in the face of such senselessness. We were scientists, yes, but we were also people. And the sheer volume of human tragedy we had cataloged was a burden no training could fully prepare us for. As the meeting concluded, I remained for a moment, staring out at the city lights. Each pinprick of light represented a life, a family, a story. 27 of those stories had been violently interrupted, meticulously frozen in time. The killer's twisted vision of immortality had not only cost lives, but it also left an indelible scar on the living, on the families who would now receive the devastating news, and on the dedicated few who had to deliver it. I understood the scientific brilliance, the sheer ingenuity of his methods. But the cost, the human cost, was a gaping wound that no scientific discovery could ever justify. Weeks, perhaps months, had bled into one another since the subterranean chamber had given up its secrets. My name, Arthur Chen, had been summoned for this final official summation. I stood at the head of the polished obsidian table, my reports neatly stacked beside a carafe of untouched water. The faces around me, the lead detective, a representative from the district attorney's office, a senior government liaison, were grim, etched with the lingering shadows of the case. This wasn't a celebration, but a solemn closure. The emergency call had been a stark reminder that even after the arrests, the legal machinery ground on, demanding precision, demanding absolute clarity. My testimony was the keystone. The perpetrator, I began, my voice steady, driven by a profound, twisted obsession with immortality, employed a unique blend of chemical compounds. The initial mummified remains, found beneath the derelict museum, were merely the first in a series. My analysis confirmed the same chemical signature across all recovered victims, linking them unequivocally to the same preservation method, the same depraved intent. I paused, letting the silence expand. Each detail I recounted was a fresh incision into the past, a reliving of the macabre artistry. The detective nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on my face, remembering the horror as vividly as I did. The legal proceedings had moved with an unusual swiftness, propelled by the irrefutable evidence my team and I had uncovered. The pursuit of immortality, they had written, transcended petty human laws. It was a philosophy that had cost several innocent lives, stretching back decades. The identities of all but one victim have now been confirmed, I continued, pushing a folder across the table. Through dental records, DNA analysis of residual tissue, careful reconstruction of their personal effects, we were able to give names back to these individuals. Their families, after years of agonizing uncertainty, have finally been able to lay them to rest. A profound, quiet satisfaction settled within me at that thought. The image of a grieving parent, clutching a faded photograph, replaced the grim tableau of the boardroom. That was the true resolution, the enduring power of what I did. To speak for the silent, to bring peace to the living. It was a heavy burden, but one worth carrying. My gaze drifted to the city lights outside, each one a tiny beacon in the vast expanse. The killer's conviction had been secured, the final gavel falling just last week. Justice, in its slow, methodical way, had been served. Yet the question of why lingered, a persistent echo in the quiet corners of my mind. What drives a person to such extreme lengths, to pervert the very essence of human connection into a perverse scientific endeavor? The pursuit of immortality in this instance had become a morbid mockery of life itself. The senior liaison cleared his throat, pulling me back to the present. And the museum, Arthur? Any recommendations for its future? I turned back, meeting his gaze. The Historical Society has begun its reevaluation. My suggestion, and one I believe is gaining traction, is to transform a portion of the site into a memorial. A place not just to remember the victims of this specific case, but to honor all who vanish without a trace. The derelict building, once a silent accomplice to horror, could become a beacon of remembrance, a stark reminder of the value of every life. The meeting concluded with a series of formal handshakes and quiet acknowledgments. As I gathered my reports, the lead detective approached. "You did good, Arthur. Really good." I met his gaze, a shared understanding passing between us. The good was measured not just in convictions, but in the closure offered, the voices restored. Stepping out into the crisp night air, the city hummed around me. The weight of the past weeks, months, years of this case began to lift, replaced by a somber resolve. This was my purpose, I realized. The pursuit of knowledge, when tempered by empathy and a profound respect for human dignity, was a powerful, necessary force. The museum, or the memorial that might rise from its ashes, would be a testament to that, and to the enduring power of forensic science to bring truth to light and give a voice to the silent dead.